They laughed at her before the snow came, before the first wind screamed across the basin and stripped the last of the red leaves from the cottonwoods, before the sky turned white and never seemed to stop snowing, before folks realized this winter wasn't like the ones before, but by then the laughter had stopped, and no one could hear her name spoken without a tremble of shame. It started earlier than anyone expected, late October, and already the river had a skin of ice on it. Elk were coming down lower than usual, spooked from the higher ridges. Coyotes roamed bold in daylight, sniffing along fence lines. There was a stillness in the mountains, the kind that made men squint at the sky and mutter things they didn't want their wives to hear. But nobody listened to that kind of quiet the way she did. Her name was Clara Wexley, a widow, 32, 3 children, no man, Nostook, no kin left nearby. Just a leaning shack 2 miles past the edge of the basin's last settlement, so crooked and weather-beaten that the cattleman joked it only stood upright, out of habit. But Clara didn't laugh. She'd buried her husband in that soil, buried to babies, too. She didn't have the kind of laughter that came easy anymore. Folks thought she'd lose the cabin after Hank died, thought she'd pack up the little ones, Emmeline, Josie, and 4-year-old Tim, and beg her way into someone's parlor in town, maybe remarry, maybe vanish. But she didn't. She stayed, and as the season crept cold, she worked. Not worked like the rest of them, not like mending a fence or patching draft holes with rags. No. Clara dug, hauled, dragged logs alone, split stones, packed earth, hammered, rusted nails with blistered hands. She scavenged from the burned-out barn on Peterson's old lot, pulled beams from a collapsed mine shaft. She built things, strange things. She nailed thick slabs of wood across her windows, but left small gaps toward the top for something she called a draft choke. She buried her fire pit and dug a channel behind it that ran under the cabin floor, lining it with flat stone she blackened. With soot, she packed the outer walls with clay and horsehair and wet moss, and sealed them again with tar she'd bartered for. She added a second roof, not laid in top, but built up and over like a hood, and filled the space between with leaves and mud and straw she dreed herself. When she asked the miller for his broken grain sacks, folks started watching. When she bartered a Holman salt supply for a cracked iron stove door, they whispered. When she roped her children into hauling buckets off dirt to mound against the shack walls, they started laughing, not cry at first, just the way neighbors do when they see someone doing something that don't make sense to them. Looks like the widow's building a fort. One ranch hand joked, she waiting for Sue or snowballs? Someone else added, Fort Clara, they started calling it. Evan carved it into a whiskey barrel lid and hung it on a post out front as a joke. She didn't take it down, but the joke stopped being funny in November. The snow hit early, hard and fast. First a dusting, then feet, then a whiteout had sealed every door and blanketed every roof. For the first 3 days, folks thought it had melted by the weekend. It didn't, and more came. In town, the saloon stayed warm, but only because the men kept drinking. The general store ran out of kerosene the first week at the livery. Horses froze to death inside their stalls. The schoolhouse chimney collapsed under an ice dam. Folks began to burn furniture, then books, then whatever they had left. The cabins farther out. Worse, chimneys couldn't draw. Roofs collapsed under weight. One boy died from smoke inhalation when his father tried to burn coal in a wood stove. Another froze trying to reach his uncle's place 5 miles off, and still the snow came. It wasn't a storm anymore, it was a siege. Someone remembered Clara. Then a rancher, Jonas Bell, tried to check on her, loaded up 2 mules with blankets and jerky, and set off. He made it halfway before a drift swallowed the trail, and one mule vanished into a sink of white. Jonas turned back, told folks saw her roof through the trees and smoke rising steady, but no one answered his calls. They said she was probably already dead, but inside Fort Clara, inside that foolish fortified shack, it was warm, not blazing, but livable. She lit a fire once in the morning, let it smolder into the underfloor channel, and let the warmth crawl beneath the beds. The packed walls held the heat. The draft chokes pulled in air, slow and steady. The roof double-layered, dripped, but never caved. Her children slept huddled, but not shivering. They wore the coats she'd quilted from old flour sacks and rabbit hide. They drank broth from dried roots thickened with marrow and flour. They read by lard lamps and whispered stories when the wind roared too loud. And Clara barely slept, not because off cold, but because she'd done the math, counted the days, counted the jars, counted how long the heat would hold, how many coals were left, how much water could be melted before the roof ice were thin. She was warm, yes, but she knew that warm ran out. Always. Then came the scream, not hers, not her children's. It came from outside, somewhere in the woods, distant, male, then again closer. The knocking, not at her door, at her wall. Someone had stumbled through the white and was beating bare fists against her packed earthen wall. Screaming for help, she hesitated. That moment would haunt her forever. That pause. That split-second debate between opening the door and letting her children freeze, or doing nothing and letting a man die. But she moved, tore the boards off the door, and cracked it open just wide enough. A man fell through, half dead, frost-bitten, face blue, eyes glazed. She dragged him in, stripped his clothes, wrapped him in pelts. Her children cried, not from fear, but from the wind that burst in behind him. She resealed the door, heart pounding, eyes locked on the snow now blowing into the cracks she'd worked so hard to seal. His name was Elijah Crane, a trapper from south of the basin. He tried to reach town after his shelter caved in. He had no food, no fire, no bearings, only kept moving by muttering his wife's name. Shutty last spring, Clara warmed him with stones, made him drink broth, nursed his fingers back from black tord. He was the first to see the shack and not laugh, and when he sat up and looked round and saw how the ceiling hadn't sagged, how the warmth came from the floor, how the wind barely hissed through the thick plastered walls, he didn't joke. He wept, told her she'd done something no man he knew had done. That night she let him stay. He helped melt ice, mended a broken handle, and when she told him her plan, that the heat would run out in 2 weeks if they didn't ration, he didn't argue. He nodded, said he'd carry snow and dig latrines and sleep by the wall to catch draft. And in the dead still of that night, the wind dropped just for a moment, and in that moment, Clara heard something, screaming again, but this time more than one voice. This time, children. Clara didn't think. She was already pulling on her boots before Elijah managed to sit up straight. The sound had been faint, yes, but not distant, not imagined. She knew the voice of a child's cry when it cracked against the wind. She knew the pitch of real terror, the kind that no pretend game ever came close to. It hit her like a stone to the ribs. Stay with them, she said, voice low but sharp, jerking her chin toward the corner where Emmeline was clutching Tom tight. Josiah had buried herself under the patchwork hide. Eyes wide, Elijah grunted, stood, but swayed. He still wasn't right. Clara, wait, it's night. But she was already unbolting the back hatch. She hadn't built it for guests. It was a crawl hole, meant for waste disposal. A trickle of fresh air if the door ever got blocked, and maybe, if things turned an escape. It opened beneath the slanted back overhang, where she'd piled snow-packed logs against the wall. Clara pushed the wood aside. With shaking hands, slipped into the hole, and braced herself for the white. That cold was immediate, bitter, punishing. It slashed into her cheeks and stole the moisture from her mouth before she could even cry out. The moon was nearly full behind the clouds. A gray glow that gave everything a deathly pale sheen. Windhold. Through the trees, low, hungry, and constant. Then again, the cry closer this time. Clara staggered toward it, keeping one hand on the edge of the woodpile as she moved. It was so easy to lose direction out here, so easy to get turned around and buried. She counted her steps, 17, 18, her legs sank thigh-deep in drifts. On the 25th step, her toe struck something. She fell forward, hands catching the edge of a snow-crusted bundle. It moved. Help, came the voice, small, choked. Clara swept snow off the bundle and found a girl, maybe 6 years old, teeth chattering, face blotched blue, no coat, just a torn shawl. She had her arms wrapped around some mething. A boy? Younger, unmoving. No, no, Clara muttered, wrenching the girl up, cradling the boy close. Shouldn't check for breath. Not yet. She had to move. She turned, retraced her steps. 10, 11, 15. The woodpile wasn't there. Panic surged. The white was too thick now. The wind had swallowed her tracks. She spun, trying to find Thessalent of her shack's shadow, the shape of the trees, anything. She squinted through the gusting snow, then saw it, a dark slit in the drift. The back crawl hole slightly ajar, a warm glow within. She lurched forward and shoved the girl inside first, then passed the boy through. She crawled in last, legs shaking so hard she could hardly close the hatch behind her. Snow followed them in, stinging their backs, their hair. Inside, Elijah had cleared the floor. The children scrambled back, making room as Clara laid the boy down near Thorm's stone patch. His skin was waxy. She pressed her ear to his chest. No beat. She slammed her palms into his chest. Once, twice, again, still nothing. She pinched his nose, breathed into his mouth again. Again, the girl screamed. A short high note of grief and disbelief. And then suddenly a gasp. The boy's eyes shot open. He gagged, coughed, curled tight, and cried. Clara collapsed beside him, arms thrown around both children. She didn't realize she was weeping until Emily knelt beside her and wiped her cheek. The shack, for the moment, held its warmth, but it wasn't a moment of rest. It was a moment of reckoning. Because now she had 5 children and enough food for 4 and still weeks left of winter siege. They learned the girl's name was Ruth. Her brother was Micah. Their parents had tried to reach a cousin's place near Dry Hollow. The trail had vanished in a whiteout, and the family's small sled had tipped. Their father had stayed behind to try and right it. Their mother had gone back to look for a lost pack. Neither returned. Ruth had tried to keep Micah warm under the sled canvas, but the wind pulled it away in the night. They had wandered, hoping to find a cabin. She remembered seeing smoke days ago. She remembered Clara's shack from summer rides to the basin edge. It was a miracle. Clara didn't think in those terms often, not since Hank, not since the second child that hadn't made it past her second winter. But this was something else. A child's memory and stubbornness had brought them straight into her arms. The cost of that miracle, though, was rationed food, tighter quarters, and more risk. Elijah said it plainly the next morning. We don't have enough, I know, if the storm breaks. We'll head for town. If it doesn't, we make it stretch. He looked at her, not with doubt, but with calculation. Then he nodded. I'll cut smaller logs, make the heat last longer. I'll reduce the broth, add more root, less meat. Tom will cry. He'll get used to it. Elijah was quiet for a moment, then turned toward the crawl hole. I'll pack it tighter, no more chances. He paused. You shouldn't have gone out. You were half dead. Who else would have? He met her gaze. You shouldn't have. Then he went to work. The days blurred. Light and dark meant little. The clouds never parted, and the wind rarely paused. They lived by routine. Wake warm, melt snow, cook, clean, tell stories, sleep in shifts. Clara taught Emmeline how to scrape frost off the ceiling beams. Josie learned to keep the lard lamps filled without spilling. Ruth cleaned and rewound the spare wool wraps. Elijah taught Micah how to split kindling from scrap without wasting strength. And Tom, little Tom, learned to be quiet. That was the hardest. At 4, he didn't understand rationing or silence, or why he couldn't climb into Clara's arms. Never. He wanted. She still held him. Yes, but only after she'd seen every other child settled. He grew pale, then quiet, then more pale, then feverish. Clara touched his forehead on the 6th day. It was damp. Elijah, she said, not loud, not urgent, but final. He came quickly. They had no proper medicine, no willow bark, no tonic. They boiled cloth and used it to cool his head. They burned the fire brighter to bright, just to push heat into his bones. Clara gave him her share of broth that night, then her share the next day. Then he stopped crying, not because he felt better, but because he didn't have the strength. That's when Clara began to pray, not loud, not on her knees, just under her breath in the dark while everyone slept. She didn't pray for rescue or a warm spring or even for the children to make it. She prayed that when it was time, if it came to that, she'd have the strength to make the right choice. Then late that night, the knocking came again, not fists this time. Tools, axes. Elijah grabbed the fire iron. Clarora snuffed the lamp and crawled to the wall. The knocks were rhythmic, 3, then 2, then pause. Not random, not frantic. Then came a voice. Miss Wexley, Clarora. It was Jonas Bell. She flung the hatch open and pulled him inside before she could think better. 2 other men followed. One was limping, one collapsed the second he crossed the threshold. They brought cold, snow, blood, and news. Town was dying, the general store had burned down. In a stovepipe accident, the livery was gutted by wind, the saloon caved in and crushed 3 men. The schoolhouse signy fire spread, people were scattering. Some froze trying to reach old claims in the hills, others treed for the river, some just vanished. We saw your roof from the ridge, Jonas said, eyes wide at the ceiling structure. Didn't believe it was still standing. Clarora fed them without asking questions. She could see what they were, survivors barely, if they'd made it. More might try, more might come. And her food was gone by dawn. She knew what had to be done. She gathered the children. Elijah stood behind her. Jonas and his men were asleep in the corner. We're going to save the heat, she said. We're going to make one big burn. Then seal the fire on the floor. After that, no more open flames. Can we still eat? Josie asked. Yes. Clarora lied. But Elijah knew. He saw it. He said nothing. He just went outside before dawn and hauled back snow-drenched wood until his arms bled through his sleeves. They burned the fire until it was a roaring wall of light. Then they sealed it. The floor glowed with heat, and the silence after was deafening. Clarora curled with Taunt at night, whispering lullabies she couldn't finish. And in the darkness, Micah cried softly into his sister's arms. By the 14th day, the inside of the shack no longer smelled like smoke. Thatched have been a blessing. A sign the fires had worked their heat into the floor stones, and the packing layers were doing their job. But Clarora missed the smoke. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant choice. Now the heat came online from what remained stored in the walls and the earth and floor. A slow-fading ember that Clarora could feel in her knees when she stood too long, and in her breath when she woke to frost on her lashes. It was enough to stave off death, but only barely. No more cooking, no more melting. The lard for the lamps was frozen stiff. The shack had become atom with soft walls, its warmth tapering like a breath you couldn't quite finish taking. The men from town, Jonas Bell and the others, had not been idle. The one who collapsed on arrival, a ranch hand named Matty, had not risen since. His body remained in the corner, wrapped in a tarp Clarora kept for firewood carrying. They didn't speak of Feme. The other man, Harlan, had a frost-bitten leg that was turning dark from the thigh down. He gritted through it with clenched teeth and one-word sentences, but Clarora saw the signs. If spring didn't come, and soon Harlan wouldn't see another morning, Jonas did his best. He tried to fix the draft chokes to check the roof pack the crawl hole, but he didn't understand the logic of Clarora's construction. He'd never seen heat move through a tunnel of packed stone. He asked questions, and she answered patiently at first, then coldly when he began questioning her priorities. You let into more mouths, he muttered one morning, not looking her in the eye. I saved 2 children, she replied, and doomed the rest of them. She didn't answer that. He didn't say it again, but Clarora saw the look in his eyes every time he watched Tom Wee in sleep. Every time Ruth or Josie reached for another spoonful of broth Clarora didn't have. Every time Micah asked if his parents might come tomorrow. Jonas had seen death on the trail, and now he was measuring it inside her shack, calculating which body would fail first. Emmeline changed first. She stopped speaking, not out of fear or sadness, but resolve. She sat with Josie and Ruth most often, helping them sew extra patches into the bedding with whatever cloth could be salvaged. She folded the children's things at night, watched over Tom when Clarora couldn't, and never once asked for a second helping of anything. Her eyes were older now, Older than a 12-year-old should carry. Elijah caught it, too. She's like you. He said on night as he helped Clara rub frost off the inner door hinges. The way she watches. The way she waits. I'm not waiting, Clara replied. You are for the Thor, for death, for someone else to make a decision you don't want to make. He said it without malice, but the words hung like smoke that had nowhere to rise. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew he was right. Every day her body weakened while her mind kept racing ahead, counting the dwindling resources, measuring how long the stored heat would last. How many more drops of snow melt she could coax from the chimney stones before they went dry? How many calories lay in a single dried root knot? And how many children's shirts she could keep beating with that math? On the 16th day, Micah passed out mid-sentence. They were playing a quiet game. The children had taken to drawing letters with their fingers on the frost-glazed wall. Guessing words silently to preserve breath, Ruth had just finished spelling home, and Micah had turned to answer when his knees folded and head dropped like a string-cut puppet. Elijah caught him. There was no fever, no cough, just nothing. Clara dripped melted snow onto his tongue, dabbed his face with the last warmed cloth she had tucked near the stone floor, rubbed his limbs until color returned. When he woke, he didn't speak, just turned his face into her chest and trembled. That night, she gave him her portion again, and the next morning, Jonas confronted her. This can't go on, he said, standing over her as she knelt near the sealed fireplate. You're welcome to leave, don't insult me. You came here invaded, you brought nothing. You think your old decisions. We're all dying, I know that, then stop. Pretending it's not happening, she stood slowly, every joint HAD now. Her fingers were wrapped in strips of cloth to cover the cracks and burns from frostbite. Her hair was knotted, lips split, but her eyes, they were steady. You want to talk rations? Talk to Elijah, she said. You want to talk survival, you make a plan. You want to talk death. She stepped closer, then you be the one to speak it too. The children, not me. Jonas left their room. That night, Emmeline followed Clara outside. The wind had died for the first time in weeks. A pale moon shone weakly through parting clouds. Clara had gone to dump the waste bucket far from the crawl hole. Keeping her scarf pulled tight to her nose, Emmeline stood beside her without speaking. You shouldn't be out here, Clara said softly. I'm not cold. Clara doubted that. But she didn't press. They stood in silence until Emmeline spoke. If you had to pick one of us, she said, voice quiet, you'd pick Tom. It wasn't a question. Clara's breath caught. I wouldn't ask you to, Emmeline continued, but I know he's small. He needs you. Clara looked at her daughter. Really looked. Emmeline was thinner now. Her coat hung looser. Her cheekbones were sharp, skin pale, but there was no fear in her eyes. Only acceptance and something else. Purpose. I would pick none of you, Clara said. I would pick myself. If I had to lose someone, I would choose to go before any of you. You can't. Yana, we'd all fall apart. Clara reached for her, hands trembling. Don't make me say things like this. You didn't have to say them, the girl whispered. Just don't lie. The wind rose again and Clara pulled Emmeline into her arms and held her tighter than she had in weeks. On the 17th day, Harlan died. It was quiet. He stopped groaning on the night. Elijah found him in the morning, jaw slack, frost blooming at the corners of his eyes. They didn't bury him. The ground was too hard, the crawl hole too narrow. They wrapped him in a spare pelt, then laid him in the crawl channel just inside the back wall. It was the coldest place in the shack. Clara told the children he'd gone to sleep and wouldn't wake up. Ruth cried. Josie just nodded. Emmeline sat beside the bundle for an hour without moving. Jonas didn't speak, but he wouldn't meet Clara's eyes anymore. The next day, the roof creaked. Clara froze. Then she moved like lightning. Elijah, it's settling. The second roof, the one she'd built over the original, filled with mud and straw insulation, was doing its job, but the snowpack had become too heavy. It sagged like a load-bearing wall under strain, and the temperature had dropped low enough to freeze even the packed insulation into solid weight. Elijah and Jonas climbed into the rafters. They wedged the beams into place beneath the lead-bearing slats and began hammering braces. Clara gathered every child into the warmest corner and told them, tossing softly to keep fear from settling in. Then came the crack, not loud, but final. A support beam split halfway through its middle. Elijah shouted. Clara screamed at the children to get under the beds. Jonas leapt, trying to hold a brace that wasn't his to carry, and then silence. Not collapse, just stillness. The beam didn't fall, but the entire roof had sunk another inch. Elijah climbed down, breathing hard. That's it. It holds for now, but another foot of snow will kill us. Jonas finished. Clara stood by the door. We need to dig, she said. They turned. Dig what? Jonas asked, out through the crawl. We can't hold here forever. You said we couldn't go. We can't. Stay. Jonas hesitated. There's nothing out there. I'm not trying to find town, Clara said. I'm trying to find a way out before the roof falls in. They argued. Elijah sided with Clara. Jonas didn't, but they all knew the truth. If they didn't start moving snow now, it would bury them alive later, and so, with frost-bitten fingers and rope, rapid shovels, they began to dig. Elijah led the tunnel outward through the crawl channel and angled it toward the slope behind the cabin. Jonas packed snow behind them, keeping the interior from losing too much heat. Clara rationed movement, sent Emmeline out with warm stones to mark the tunnel's bend and return. Every 2 hours, they switched. Every 4 hours, someone fainted, but by the end of the day, they'd made 6 feet. And that night, for the first time in 18 days, Clara stepped outside into air that did not howl. The stars were out, the wind was gone, the cold was deep, terrifyingly deep, but it was silent. And in that silence, Clara heard a sound she hadn't heard since the blizzard began. A wolf's howl from far away, then another, but behind it, distant, still came a deeper rumble like water, a shifting, a beginning. That night, no one slept. Not because of fear or the cold or even hunger. Thoggle 3 were close companions by now, but because of something more dangerous than any of them, hope. The stars had returned. The wind had died. And though the temperature had dropped to a merciless low that made the very walls we ice, the stillness meant change. Clara had seen it before, the way the world paused before a season turned. Sometimes the coldest night came just before a thaw, but sometimes it came just before collapse. By the faint light of the lard lamp, she sat on the floor, holding Tom against her chest. His breath was faint but steady, his skin gnawing or burned with fever. She could feel every rib in his back, every bone in his bird-like shoulders. She'd given him everything, and it still might not be enough. Elijah sat by the crawl hole, sharpening the last usable edge of the broken fire iron, not for defense. There was nothing left to defend. It was for digging. The tunnel had grown another for that day, but now curved upward toward where Clara believed a ridge sloped down, toward the frozen creek basin. If they could break through, even just for air, even just to see the sun, maybe it would give the others strength. Jonas was the only one still awake among the rest. He sat by the children, back against the wall, head resting against a beam that groaned every so often with the weight above. He hadn't spoken much since Harlan died, not since the roof sagged, but Clara had seen him working with silent desperation. Hands roar from hammering, dragging old pelts into the tunnel to pack the floor, smoothing walls where the frost threatened collapse. For all his bluster, he had not left. He had not run. That meant something. In the corner, Ruth held Micah's hand. Emelina sat beside Josie, gently combing fingers through her hair as she whispered a story. One Clara had told them long ago about a rabbit and a warm burrow and a spring that came so early. The snow just gave up trying, and Clara, who had not prayed aloud since her husband died, whispered for words into the top of Tom's head as she rocked him against their chest. Just one more day. The digging began again at dawn. They rotated in pairs. Jonas and Elijah took the lead with shovels, sometimes just hands. Clara and Emmeline followed behind, hauling loose snow and dumping it at the inner mouth of the crawl. The children, now too weak to do more than stir the cooking pot or fold the blankets, were tasked with the most sacred duty left: waiting, staying warm, staying ready. They broke through the upper wall of the tunnel. On the 21st day, Elijah was the one who hit the gap. The snow above him gave suddenly, and bitter air rushed in like a slap, but beyond it was sky. Pale blue, muted, but ski nonetheless. He laughed, a single rasping sound, then more. Jonas joined him, dragging himself out of the narrow hole and into the open. Clara heard it from inside. She left Tom in Emmeline's arms and crawled to the tunnel mouth herself. Her breath caught in her throat. It was morning, a real morning. The sky was clear, high, and pale like eggshell. The trees were heavy with frost, yes, but no longer suffocating under the weight of fresh fall. In the distance, the line of the ridge was visible. It sloped no longer indistinguishable from the sky. The snow was still deep, deadly deep, but it was starting to settle to crust. That meant it would begin to melt soon, days, maybe weeks, but they had a view now, they had a way out. She emerged fully, knee-sinking. The air stung her skin like lashes, but she didn't care. From here, she could see that their shack was amicable. The roof had not fallen. The second layer construction, now bowed under the weight of 3 weeks of blizzard snow, still held its angle. The chimney was gone, fully sealed, but the venting structure she'd made from the cracked stovepipe still jutted slightly from the rear, puffing out the faintest coil of warmth that must have been invisibly during the storm. The boards, where the windows had shifted, but none were broken. The walls, thick with clay andered and snow-packed straw, looked as solid as any barn she'd ever seen. It was grotesque, ugly, a hodgepodge of desperation and grit, but it had survived. She wiped her nose and whispered, "Fought Clara." Elijah helped her back down inside. She told the children. They didn't cheer, they didn't even smile. But the silence that followed was the kind of silence Clara hadn't heard in days. Not fear, not dread, just breath, just stillness. That evening, the floor heat ran out. Clara had felt it the moment she stepped down barefoot onto the stones. Beside Tom's cot, cold, not frozen, not yet, but no longer warm. She didn't tell the others. She just nodded once to Elijah. He understood they couldn't risk another fire. The risk of collapse was too high. Even the small ones, the smoldering sticks near the vent stones, could cause ice above the roofline to shift. Instead, they packed tighter, every blanket, every pelt. The children huddled beneath them in layers. Elijah and Jonas dug a deeper trough in the floor to keep cold air from pooling, and Clara sat awake most of the night again, thinking if the weather held, they could attempt the descent in 2 days, but they'd need sleds, food, wrapping, and most dangerous of all, they'd need the children to walk. The next day, Ruth collapsed, not from illness or accident, just weariness. Her body gave up. Clara found her curled near the tunnel mouth, still holding the melted snow cup she'd been fetching. She was breathing but shallow, skin cold. There was no more broth. There was no more heat. Elijah looked to Clara, his eyes red. "We wait." Another day, well as one. She didn't speak. Then 2, he added. Then it's a race between the Thor and the bodies. Jonas sat against Thule, sharpening a piece of stovepipe into a sled runner. "If we try to go now, we won't make it to Miles. Staying isn't saving us," Elijah said. "We need another night," Clara said. Finally, they all looked to her. "We need one more night, one more rest, then we take what we have, what we can carry, and we go." No one argued, but everyone understood. That night, Clara sat with each child, with Josie. She sang the hummingbird song her husband had made up years ago when she wouldn't sleep. With Ruth, she tucked the girl's hands into thick wool wraps and fed her the last sliver of dried apple she'd been saving. With Micah, she gave him the smallest bit of sugar scrape from the bottom off tea tin. "It's not candy," she said, "but it's close." With Emmeline, she said nothing, just pulled her close and rested her forehead to her daughter's, whispering, "I see you." And with Tom, her last, she cradled him in silence, wrapped around his small body like armor. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not until dawn cracked gray through the tunnel mouth. They left on the 23rd day. The sun was dim, barely, climbing above the ridgeline, but it was there. It cast long shadows. It lit the trees with a dull gleam, and most of all, it revealed the path. The tunnel opened near a small downward slope Clara had guessed would lead to the dry creek bed. It was hard to tell if the basin beyond was frozen, solid or just coated in surface ice, but it would be passable. From there, it was for miles to the edge of town, assuming town still stood. They packed what little they could, one sled made from floorboards and stove piping, lashed together with soaked and frozen twine, a second rig made from 2 chairs nailed, flat with pelts stitched beneath to drag. They carried no food, only wraps, melted snow in bottles and cloth to bind feet. Clara carried Tom. Jonas pulled Ruth and Micah. Elijah took Josie and Emmeline walked. She never asked to be carried. She walked. Each step was a prayer, each breath a challenge. The cold clung to them like a second skin, but they moved. 1 mile, 2, the creek bed opened, and in the distance through the haze, Clara saw smoke rising. A chimney, then another, then the town, or what was left of it. She cried. Elijah stumbled to his knees. Jonas fell, then stood again, and they moved forward. They arrived just before the sun fell. A fire was burning in the shell of the general store. Women rushed out, men followed, blankets, water, screams, hands, arms, and children. Somali children staring wide-eyed at the strange procession from the snow, a ghost train of ash-faced survivors. Someone said her name. Clara didn't hear it. She was already slipping to her knees. Tom in her arms as the warmth finally wrapped around her again, and from behind her. Emmeline's voice, she built it. She kept us alive. Spring didn't come fast. It never did in the basin, even after the town began to rebuild, even after the days grew long and the wind softened. The freeze clung to the mountains like an old spiteful ghost, but inside the general store supper loft, hastily turned into a shelter for the sick and the survivors, the frost finally began to lift. Clara opened her eyes for the first time in 2 days to the sound of soft breathing, not hers. Tom's curled in a cot beside her. His small chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of sleep, not struggle. His cheeks were pink, not blue, and his hair, tangled and matted, had been gently brushed to one side. She reached out, barely able to lift her arm, and touched his face. He stirred, whimpered, then whispered, "Mommer." That single word cracked her. Tears came silently, not kind born of pain or fear, but the slow seeping flood of release. She had not known if she would ever hear Itagan. She hadn't dared hope. Across the room, Emmeline stirred and rose from her cot. She had barely slept. Since their arrival in town, too many hands to help, too many children to comfort. She had cleaned Ruth and Micah helped dress Elijah's wounds. Even sat beside Jonas during the hours when his fever broke and returned. Clara had watched her from behind half-lidded eyes, half awake, and seen not a girl anymore, but something harder, older, deeper. The child she'd raised was gone, but in her place stood someone stronger. "You're awake," Emmeline whispered. Claire ranted, "Tom, better, the others alive?" Clara closed her eyes again, not in sleep, but in quiet, in thanks, in disbelief. The town had changed. Much of it was gone. The schoolhouse had collapsed entirely. The livery was just a pile of scorched beams. The saloon, once the warmest place in town, had become a soup line for the displaced, but the people, those who remained, had changed more than any structure. When word spread that Clara Wexley had saved 5 children, 3 grown men, and a home they'd all mocked, a silence fell over the settlement. It wasn't just guilt. It wasn't just awe. It was something more difficult for proud people to express. Reverence. No one allowed about Fort Clara anymore. In fact, by the end of April, the name had passed into town talk like it was always meant to be spoken with seriousness. Children whispered stories about it in the alleyways. Men at the store used it when referring to any structure that looked solid enough to outlast a storm. "That's a good fort, Clara. While y'all get there," they'd say, a nod with respect. It became a phrase, a measure. She was offered rooms, offered food, blankets. A plot closer to the heart of town, but Clara refused. She had no need for comfort, given by men who hadn't mocked her work and her name. What she needed now wasn't charity. It was a future. She asked for lumber instead, and when spring truly came, When the first green tips broke through the thawed dirt, Clara took her children back into the basin. The shack was still standing barely. The second roof had finally buckled, collapsed under Thither's shifting weight. The vent pipe had broken off. The outer walls had cracked in places where the frozen mud swelled and burst, but the structure, the bones had held. The door still opened inside. The floor stones were cold, but intact. The bedding was damp, but salvageable. The air was stale, yet survivable. Clara didn't weep, she didn't speak. She simply stepped over the threshold and set her hand to the beam above the doorframe. The same beam Hank had carved their initials into when they first settled it. She left her hand there a while, then turned to Elijah, who had followed them back. Not because she asked, because he had nowhere else to go, and because, as he told her plainly, "This is the only place that didn't kill me." He brought tools, he brought iron nails scavenged from town, and most importantly, he brought silence. The kind Clara had come to value more than any apology or praise. Together they began to rebuild. Not replicate, not restore, rebuild. The shack would never be the same. And it shouldn't be. It had done what it was built to do. It had kept them alive. Now it was time to make something new. Something worthy of the blood and breath that had survived within it. The children changed, too. Josie took to the land with a kind of watchful joy Clara had never seen in her before. She chased rabbits. She helped lay kindling. She began collecting stones, always in threes, for Ruth, for Micah, and for herself. Micah grew quieter, but his hands were never still. He built small structures from sticks and clay, tiny versions of fuel supports he had seen Elijah use. Ruth helped him, drawing little figures in the dirt outside to watch over them, and Emmeline, now nearly 13, took charge of rationing, of cleaning, of guiding the younger ones with a calm that left Clara breathless. She had become the second spine of the household, firm where Clara was tired, soft where Clara had become too brittle to bend. Tom spoke more, laughed more, but never asked about the fire. He remembered Lara could tell, but some memories she decided didn't need retelling. Not yet, maybe not ever. By midsummer, the new structure stood wider than before, taller, not pretty, not by town standards, but solid, insulated with a double layer of dry-act earth and clay, vented with the proper piping, roofed in beams that had been cured under openson. It had a chimney, yes, but also a buried thermal channel that stretched further now, lined in flat stone and ash. There was an actual draft choke system, this time built with sliding shutters rather than nailed boards. Clara had learned from her mistakes. She had tested everything twice. No one offered to help, and she didn't ask. Butone Day in late June, a rider came from town. He brought supplies, grain mostly, a small packet of salt, a coil of rope, an envelope. In it was a note unsigned. "You were right. You were always right. This place won't forget what you built. We've started digging cellars now, proper ones, with packed walls and venting. They call them Clara shelters. Didn't ask your permission. Hope you don't mind." Clara smiled. She didn't write back. She folded the note, tucked it under a loose plank in the wall near the stove, and let it be. By the following winter, nearly every homestead outside the basin had reinforced walls. And when the first snow came, softer, slower this time, Emmeline stood beside her mother at the new door frame and asked, "Think anyone will come knocking this year?" Clara shook her head. "If they do, we'll open the door." They stood there for a while, watching the flakes drift. Inside, Tom played near the stove. Josie and Ruth braided rope for more quilts. Micah was stacking stones near the windowsill, building tiny towers for reasons only he understood. Elijah came in from the barn with an armful of chopped kindling. "You going to stand there all day?" he asked. Clara glanced sideways at him, smiled faintly. "We were just remembering." He nodded. "We do that a lot now," and they did, but they didn't speak of it like a horror. Not like a legend either. They remembered it the way survivors remember. With quiet, with gratitude, and with the certainty that nothing had been wasted. Not a board, not a breath, not a single handful of packed earth. That winter was still called the seed winter by those who'd lived through it. But in the Wexley household, it had another name. The winter of Fort Clararer, the shack that held the widow Ho fortified, and the children who survived.